Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, from today onwards we are starting a new series, or I would say it is an extension of the previous series on women in history. Friends, in this series we are going to cover the medieval period, and specifically this series would be more thematic, that is, it is based on themes rather than chronology. Friends, for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Vip. Dr. Shruti Vip is a prolific professor, and she is currently Assistant Professor in Department of History, PGDAV Evening College, University of Delhi. Dr. Vip has immense experience, and through her experience we always get in-depth knowledge on various topics and issues. Friends, if you wish to ask questions from Dr. Shruti Vip on today's topic, or I would say this particular series, then you may talk to us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1800110430. I repeat, our number is 1800110430. You are just requested to call in the last 10 minutes of the lecture, as well as your questions should be relevant as well as should be pertaining to the series, to the topic only. Now I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Shruti Vip, once again. Hello ma'am, welcome to the lecture.
Hello Gitika. Thanks a lot for giving me this wonderful opportunity, and thanks for those kind words of appreciation and introduction. So as was just informed to all of you by Gitika, we are starting a new series, but then this is not going to be a completely different series, as we have already discussed part 1 of Women and History. But this would be different in the sense that this would be more thematic, and I would be covering those areas and topics that were left untouched in the earlier series. So I'm sure you are going to imbibe lot of knowledge as well as find it interesting. The reason is not only to know more about gender issues, because this is part of various courseworks that has been introduced at various undergraduate and postgraduate level courses, but also to experience as to how various gender issues have evolved over a period of time, and how they continue to influence women's lives in contemporary world as well. So there is going to be a lot of balancing between past and present, and also a lot of interconnections we would like to bring about between what is happening in today's world and what and how these various processes emerged over a period of time. Now, if I talk about the learning objectives, then the most important learning objectives of this series will be to recap understanding of basic feminist concepts, especially patriarchy, gender, etc., and then also to relate feminist thinking to a range of social issues, and also consolidate our understanding. Women are all the time encouraged to behave in certain ways, and these are those very ways which benefit women, which benefit men, and which do not really benefit women. So in course of our discussion, we would be talking about as to what are the cultural parameters and how these various trends have got reinforced over a period of time. Ideas about being a woman are a form of ideology, and they are created to benefit men in society. So with this kind of specific insight and a questioning mind, we would like to explore various issues, and also we would like to add a historical angle to these various issues. Now, right at the onset, a question that arises and which we all must answer is that what prevents equality? Because world over there are democratic governments who have promised to give equal rights to all the citizens, be it male and female. But as we look around, we do find out that lot of inequality still prevails. So the answer lies in the process of patriarchy. Patriarchy is a system which refers to male domination, and also it refers to the power relationships by which men dominate women, and this has been a universal phenomenon, a system whereby women are kept subordinate in a number of ways. This also can be related to patriarchy, and also it can be described as a system by which men are privileged over women. The next question that arises here is that what exactly do men control? Men very much control women's productive or labor power, and also women's reproductive power. So it is the control invariably of husband over wife, and the patriarchal state also controls women's reproduction through population control programs and through various other measures. So basically it is the control over women's sexuality, her reproductive capacity, her reproductive power, and also the way she has to appear in the public place. All this is it depends on certain norms and traditions. Then one must talk about what are the various patriarchal institutions that promote patriarchy. To my mind, the most important patriarchal institution that one can talk of is, of course, family. It is within the family that boys learn to assert, and they learn to dominate girls, to dominate their siblings, sisters, and also to submit and expect unequal treatment. And this begins right from the beginning as the girl child is born and as she is deprived of her rightful place under the sun. While a man is considered head of the family in most of the families, and in some traditional systems men exchange women. So therefore they are it is basically the whole psychology runs in such a way that women are always at the giving end while men are at the receiving end. Then another very important issue that comes to my mind while discussing patriarchy is the issue of women's mobility and how there are a number of restrictions that are laid on her free movement right from the childhood till the adulthood, and there is some kind of a control mechanism that prevails throughout her life cycle. Then also one can talk about property and other economic resources which again are more in favor of the male sex. Now another very important institution that has directly promoted patriarchy, and rather it has strengthened it a lot, is religion. So the institution of religion, especially in a country like India where family law is governed by religious law, plays a very important role. And in fact in all religions women are subordinated to men and they are considered inferior, impure and sinful. And in fact most of the scriptures have a repeated reference to this kind of a theme. Then also one can talk about the how religions influence state policy, and how though the state is supposed to be secular and the state claims itself to be a secular institution, the influence of religion cannot be denied. Having discussed this, all these institutions, now another very important institution that one can talk about is the legal system. So here a question arises as to how law has treated women. In most countries the legal system is both patriarchal as well as bourgeois, and it favors men as well as economically powerful classes. So therefore the law neither favors women nor it favors the poor and the unprivileged and the downtrodden, because the legal process in itself is a costly and time consuming affair, and a lot of resources are required in order to get yourself heard. So therefore the weaker sections of society rather remain silent and are not really able to get their grievances addressed. Then another important point that emerges here is that the systems of jurisprudence the judiciary, judges and lawyers are mostly men, though there are some exceptions now and things have begun to change, and as many more women are entering the legal career, but then largely speaking one can still talk about how judiciary is largely dominated by men. Then the economic system and the economic institutions, these also can largely be held responsible for promoting patriarchy. So within a patriarchal economic system, it is men who control the economic institutions. They own most of the property, most of the wealth, and direct economic activity is in their hands, whether you talk about trade, you talk about banking, investment, etc. And therefore it is they who determine the value of different productive activities. So here again it is patriarchy which is largely being promoted, and most productive work, however, is done by women, and it is neither recognized and nor paid for. So just imagine a world where their women would not be performing their domestic duties and the kind of chaos that would result in. But then sadly that is largely unaccounted for and unpaid for, and something that has been taken for granted over centuries. So therefore housework remains completely discounted, whereas men who are doing work in the public sphere gets lot of recognition and also gets paid for. Then one can also talk about various political systems and related institutions, and how patriarchy also unfolds itself in these institutions. Almost all political institutions in society at all levels are male dominated, and in India, with 50% of reservation for women in panchayats, their number has definitely increased, but not effectiveness, because effectively it is still the male partners who are able to dominate at that level also, and women are leaders only as namesake. Women in power due to family linkages are also is also an increasing trend, but here again it is indirectly women, it is indirectly men's power that is being exercised in name of women. Then women in parliament, in the recent times there has been a lot of debate as to how there should be an increasing representation, and there is also an ongoing debate regarding that, but till date their percentage ranges from 8 to 9%, which is definitely quite low. Then we can also talk about another very important institution and how patriarchy has rather got strengthened through this, and that is media. Media is largely in the hands of upper class, upper caste men who propagate class and gender ideology, and one can talk about the kind of serials that are portrayed on various TV channels, and the way various popular shows that are running, and with the kind of language that is being used, it has clear-cut gender bias. Messages about male superiority, male power, male intelligence, female inferiority are constantly repeated, and the way women are projected as beautiful ladies, always well decked, leaves no place for ordinary looking women, and also sexual violence has been portrayed graphically in various shows, both at the level of TV as well as the level of cinema. So this also has kind of created a very weak image of women, and how they are always in a need of protection, and how they always need to move about safely, and they always need the protection and care of the male members of the family. So therefore, while women are underrepresented in the profession of media, they are also projected in certain stereotypical ways, which has really done more harm than good. Now talking about another very important institution, and that is education, the various educational institutions and knowledge systems. So how have they contributed to the strengthening of patriarchy and patriarchal values? Since learning and education became formal and institutionalized since the beginning of the modern world, it is men who have assumed control over the whole area of knowledge. So it is a man's world, and the famous saying that knowledge is power has made men more powerful as they have more knowledge, and they have appropriated this knowledge over a period of time. For example, the female birth attendants are largely devalued, whereas the male gynecologists are given more importance. And whenever one talks about any kind of profession, it is men who appropriate the benefits of becoming professional, whether it is tailoring or it is becoming chefs or any other example one can talk of, whereas in the domestic space it is women who are performing the duties of cleaners of the house, or cooks, or stitching clothes for the family. So therefore this kind of bias has continued, and I have already delivered one whole series on this topic, that is women and education. So I think that series would be quite helpful for the viewers who are interested to know about how gender biases are promoted through education. Then also traditionally women were prevented from studying scriptures, and a lot of biases also percolated down from that. Now one can also talk about the issue of violence, as to how institutionalized violence against women has increased over a period of time. So male violence is routinely experienced by women and is also condoned, but then it has not only continued, rather it has increased over a period of time, and domestic violence has become kind of a routine practice. Especially the problem has started percolating even in the rural areas. The sexual harassment on the street is largely attributed to women's clothing, etc. And the restricted mobility is also due to the fear of rape, which again has shown an increasing trend. Female feticide, witch hunting, dowry murders are routine affairs, and every day when you open a newspaper, these are the kind of news and images that continue to haunt you. Having discussed all these various institutions and parameters, it would be now interesting to talk about what are the issues to consider. So this would be kind of a rounding up of what all themes that one can consider while the series continues. So of course there are the most important point that one can talk about with reference to patriarchy is that what are the ways through which men control women. So one needs to understand, explore those ways in order to put an end to that practice. Then also women and the home, as to how women are operating their domestic lives, their private sphere, what all is happening in their domestic routines, and how these routines need to be changed, they need to be challenged, so that the home becomes a better place to live for women. Then judgments by men, how women are increasingly being judged by the male members of the society, not only in homes but also educational institutions, in the public sphere, and then what can be done to put an end to that. Then another very important theme would be women and employment, as to here a lot of data also has been shared by you in one of the earlier series, where I have given you a lot of examples as to how things have changed over a period of time. But post globalization, again there has been a ghettoization, that is there has been more and more emphasis on certain kind of jobs, and while science and technology continues to remain the male domain, women are increasingly getting restricted in the lower paying jobs and jobs which are at the lower rung of the hierarchy. Then of course the importance of public places, public spaces needs to be analyzed as to how these spaces are appropriated largely by men, whereas women are absent from those spaces. So what can be done to reclaim those spaces, and what can be done to have a more equal representation of both men and women in these public spaces. Now these public spaces could be parks, they could be malls, they could be entertainment areas, they could be pubs, etc. Now the next important theme that in which we can talk about various issues is the gender role socialization, as to how men and women behave in particular ways. Having discussed these various issues, I shall now take a break, and then in due course of time I would be sharing with you all the details pertaining to the gender role socialization, so that we can thematically deal with these issues one by one. Thanks a lot.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for giving us this session on women in history. And friends, you're requested to be with us as we're back after a short break, and we are going to discuss more. Till then, be with us. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that from today onwards we have started a new series, or I would say it is an extension of our previous series on women in history. This is the introductory lecture where we are trying to give you in-depth knowledge on the series, the entire series, as well as what we are going to cover, and we are making grounds for you so that you could understand the forthcoming lectures too in advance, that what we are going to study further. Friends, for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Bibb. Dr. Shruti Bibb is Assistant Professor and she is teaching in Department of History, PGDAV Evening College, University of Delhi. Friends, if you wish to ask question from Dr. Bibb, then do call us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1800110430. I repeat, our number is 1800110430. Now, let's try to grab more knowledge through Dr. Bibb, and let's try to understand the entire series or this part of this session in detail. Hello ma'am, welcome to the lecture.
Hello Geetika, thanks a lot for the opportunity. So continuing our discussion on to how unfair times have been, I would like to share some details as to the kind of contribution women have made. Women do 2/3 of the world's work. So this has largely been computed by UNESCO, that while they are performing 2/3 of the world's work, they receive only 10% of the world's income. So you can well imagine how unfair the world has been to women, and they own less than 1% of land. So someone who is doing a sex who is doing 2/3 of the world's work only owns less than 1% of land. How unfair. Women in developing countries, on an average, they carry 20 liters of water per day over 6 kilometers. And of course, this is more with reference to rural areas. But now in urban areas also, in many of the peripheral urban areas also, there has been acute water shortage, and most of this job has been done by women. Women in many cases are the primary caregivers, and they are balancing the challenges of work and family, because the male members of family either migrate to the cities in search of job, or they are just not able to do anything because they are habitual drinkers and gamblers. So therefore, with these kind of difficult situations, it largely remains on women to be the primary caregivers, not only to their own for their own children, but also elderly in the families. Now, if we talk about global parameters, globally there is still a gender pay gap which exists. So it is not that the problem exists only in the developing countries like India. There is a lack of women parliamentarians, and women's health overall around the world is worse than that of men. A set of ideas that benefit men and keep women oppressed have been promoted time and again, and this is what exactly is patriarchy all about. So now, talking about the biological differences between human beings, such as sex, race, etc., have traditionally been used as grounds for social and political inequality, discrimination, subjugation, as well as exploitation. The division of social roles between men and women in the family is historically the earliest form of division of labor. So while men would go out, women would do most of the work at home, while men would be busy either hunting or gathering. But then it is very important here to clarify that women were also gathering and they were also hunting, but somehow that was not kind of remembered, and that was not kind of conveyed. It is also the earliest class division. This was also the earliest kind of class division which arises hand in hand with the establishment of the institution of private property. So with the origin of the institution of private property, especially in India from later Vedic period onwards, and with the emergence of territorial states from 6th century BCE, the differences, the economic, social, cultural differences between both the sexes, they increased manifold. So coming back to the issue of patriarchy, it literally means rule by the father, and is now understood as the dominant role of men in society, and it is the oldest form of social inequality, and it is from this institution of patriarchy that all other kind of inequalities further got a boost. The perception of patriarchy as a natural order needs to be questioned, and we all need to ask as to why this order was created and how it was created, in order to stop adhering to that order in future. Now, until recent times, women's issues, interests and concerns had been excluded from the political arena for a number of reasons, like the division between the private and the public spheres, because women were considered as part of the private sphere. So therefore, politics, which was more a thing of the public sphere, was not really considered as important and valid enough for them. The patriarchal assumptions of the language and the practice of politics also played a very important role in neglecting women for a long period. Now, here it would be interesting to talk about the feminist theories. I will not be going in much detail because I have already dealt with feminist theories in detail in some of my earlier lectures, but here it is relevant to just introduce it to you so that you are able to understand as to how things began to change and how women began to ask for political rights for themselves. So, one important strand that one can talk about feminism is the strand of liberal feminists. They were concerned with the representation and primarily the underrepresentation of women within the public spheres of modern life. So, by 20th century, this became a very important kind of school of thought, and the question that they raised were that why are women underrepresented and how do we make that representation more equal, that is how more women can participate in politics, they can get voting rights and they can also get elected. So, all these were some very important developments that started taking place from end of 19th century in Europe and also going on to the 20th century. Now, the next phase that one can talk about is the radical feminists. The radical feminists, they kind of locate relations of inequality in patriarchy. So, it was the radical feminists who thought that it was not inequality between men and women which was the root cause of the problem. The root cause, according to them, was the institution of patriarchy, that is the very same institution which gives lot of power to men over women. So, this school of thought believed that women and men are essentially different from one another, and they also agreed with liberals that women need to be more represented in the public sphere, but not on the rights on the grounds of equality, not on the grounds of their rights, but rather on the ground that women being a different voice of politics. So, therefore, they wanted to add diversity to politics, and they thought that women can contribute to politics, they can contribute to the various developments that were going on in the world differently. So, therefore, they had a right to participate, and they would rather enrich the whole process. So, they would also expand the sites of politics, not simply in the public sphere, but also the private sphere. Now, this was a very important change that came about, while the liberal feminists were not so much concerned about what was happening in the private sphere, that is in the family. Whereas, the radical feminists, because they identified the institution of patriarchy to be the most important reason behind women's exploitation, and the origin of patriarchy according to them was not in the public sphere, but it was in the private sphere, that is in the family environment, in the bedroom, in the family, in the body of women. So, therefore, it was the private sphere which according to them was as important as the public sphere. So, this change definitely added a more striking power to the movement. Now, the next school of thought that one can talk about is the postmodern feminists. The postmodern feminists agree that politics exists everywhere, but they resist the radical feminist impulse to define women and men. They are more interested in deconstructing the assumed naturalness of various political categories, including the category of women. So, therefore, they refuse to accept the given characteristic, whether it is the biological or cultural or social characteristic that has been assigned to men and women. So, the postmodernism, as is largely influenced by post-structuralism, believes in dissecting each and every and deconstructing each and every part of the whole, and then questioning the given category, and then trying to find out answers. And according to them, nothing is the truth, and things are always changing, and there should always be a scope for evolution. So, the whole society is evolving and nothing is supreme or ultimate. Now, critical feminists agree with the postmodernists that the prevailing discourses about femininity and masculinity are essential to understand how both women and men are oppressed, but they argue for greater attention to the material condition of people's lives, that is, greater attention to the economic side also, that is, their real lived conditions which will be affected by class, race, sexuality, ethnicity, religion, and so on. So therefore, according to post-modernists and according to critical feminists, it is no longer important to analyze femininity and masculinity per se. Rather, both the categories need to be further analyzed with reference to other categories, that is class, caste, race, ethnicity, religion, nationality, etc. Because when you add these descriptions to the term male or female, then the analysis completely changes. So therefore, the life of an upper class woman definitely is not the same as is experienced by a laboring class woman. So therefore, there can be no generalization per se when one talks about masculinity or femininity, because femininity again has to be dissected, has to be understood with reference to these different categories of class, caste, race, ethnicity, language, etc. Now, another strand of feminism that one can talk about is Islamic feminism, which advocates women's rights, gender equality and social justice grounded in an Islamic framework, that is with reference to Hadith and Sharia. So therefore, the whole logic is grounded in the study of Quran and in the various Islamic principles, Hadith, Sharia, etc. It is since it is rooted in Islam, the movement's pioneers have also utilized secular and Western feminist discourses, and they also recognize the role of an integrated global feminist movement. So therefore, the Islamist feminists have tried to bring about a healthy mix between what has been the world feminist discourse, the Western feminist discourse, as well as how these various teachings can be also found in Hadith, Sharia and Quran. Now, a very interesting observation that has been brought about by Deepa Kumar is that on colonial feminism, and how colonial feminism is based on the appropriation of women's rights in the service of empire and has been widely utilized in justifying aggression in the Middle East, developed over 2 centuries, of the last 2 centuries in the West. So this is kind of a very interesting description as to how Western feminism was largely colonial in nature, and it was kind of justifying the attack of imperialists over the Middle Eastern countries in name of giving rights to women who were largely exploited by the men in these areas. The 19th century in the context of European colonialism is also a very important period to talk about, and it rests on the construction. The whole theme rests on the construction of a barbaric and misogynistic Muslim world that must be civilized by the so-called liberal enlightened West. Again, this is a rhetoric, and it was far from reality, and this has also been given the name of gendered Orientalism, as to how a particular kind of notion regarding the Orient was being promoted by the Western scholars and administrators in order to justify their presence in these regions. But this does not mean that they were genuinely interested in the cause of upliftment of women. Now, having discussed these various themes, I would now like to come to the historical context of women's struggle for equality of rights. Now, women's struggle for equality of rights has been one of the key components of the global struggle for democracy since the beginning of early modern world, and one can definitely give reference to the French Revolution and how women participated in such a violent and very important way in French Revolution. But what they gained out of French Revolution remains for all of us to see that in name of rights they got nothing. So therefore, while their striking power was utilized by men, when it came to sharing power with them, it was a big no. A very important role in this demand for equal rights was played by Mary Wollstonecraft. As you can see the image on the screen, her period was from 1759 to 1797, and she can definitely be called the founder of modern feminism. Mary Wollstonecraft's book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which came out in 1792, which was a very important phase of the French Revolution, is a very important and a must read for everyone, and especially those who are interested in knowing more about gender struggles and women's history. In this, Mary Wollstonecraft wrote some very important, emphatic statements that I would like to share with the audience. She stated, "The divine right of husbands, like the divine right of kings, may, it is helped in this enlightenment age, be contested without danger." So she questioned the divine right of husbands, just as people were questioning the divine right of kings. So while the divine right of French king had been questioned, it had been, countered, and the monarchy had been overthrown. But she was questioning that as to why the divine right of husbands still continues. Then another very important statement was, "I do not wish women to have power over men, but over themselves." How strong a statement for someone writing in 18th century, that it is important to have power over yourselves. Don't have power over men. That is not what is a very a wishful thinking, but to have power over your own being, to think independently and not to let anyone rule your psyche. This is what women ask for, they should ask for. So historians considered the rights of women, perhaps a vindication of the rights of women, perhaps the most original book of the century, and for the first time a woman dared to sit down to write a book which was not so which was not an echo of men's thinking, nor it was an attempt to do rather well, or her aim was not to make the book very popular or to create a bestseller. It was what she was thinking about, and it was what she wanted other women to do and think about themselves, and it was the first attempt at exploration of the problems of society, a genuine drive to explore the problems of society, and also more from a morals standpoint, which recognize the values that are hidden in humanity, or the values that should be there in humanity. So therefore, with this kind of attitude, the book definitely continues to inspire even today. Now, another very important contributor to the cause of feminist history and the movement for women's rights was Elizabeth Stanton, 1815 to 1902. She was the founder of the women's suffrage movement in the US. Now, this again was a very important phase of history, because women still had not got rights to vote in US. So even after American War of Independence, and after so many years of development, industrialization, and also imperialism, it was women who continued to remain confined to the domestic sphere. Elizabeth Stanton wrote the Declaration of Sentiments in 1848, which stated, "The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. So the use of the term tyranny was very important, because here what she was trying to make public was the undue control that men continued to have over women. It was reminding her of the tyrannical rule of the rulers over their subjects, something that had been done away with as early as end of 18th century in Europe and America, but still this tyrannical rule was continuing and it was not coming to an end in near future. So she raised a voice against this, and this is how the whole concept of demand of voting rights, suffrage movement became very important. Now this also needs to be seen in the background of how a working class movement was taking shape in America, and how the laboring class, they were becoming more vocal about their, not only their economic rights but also political rights, and women were definitely giving a striking force to this movement by participating in long marches, by participating in picketing, etc. Now there are some facts about gender discrimination that continue to exist, that continue to influence mid 19th century Europe onwards, which I am going to share, which would help you understand the importance of these kind of demands and how it was so relevant for Mary Wollstonecraft and Stanton to talk about dignity and rights of women. So from mid 19th century Europe, when most of Europe had experienced some kind of revolutions and they were on the path of democratic upliftment, married women were legally dead in the eyes of the law. So once a woman was married, they invariably used to lose their legal rights, because they were considered as living under their husbands. So women were not allowed to vote. Women had to submit to the laws when they had no voice in their formation. So they were just supposed to obey the laws, while they had no voting rights and they had no say in the formation of the laws. Married women, of course, had no property rights, and most occupations were closed to women, and when women did work, they were paid only a fraction of what men earned, and this was true for women and children who were working in various factories that started mushrooming during the Industrial Revolution, and the trend continued not only in England but in other countries of Europe also. Women were not allowed to enter professions such as medicine or law, and with great difficulty they were able to enroll themselves in subjects like mathematics and science, and that also had to be done secretly, and there are a number of stories and anecdotes that have been written regarding this. Then women had no means to gain an education, since no college or university would accept women students. This again was a tragedy for a continent like Europe, which was claiming to be so progressive and which had assumed on itself the white man's burden to civilize rest of the world, and which was on that imperialist mission to bring about a change in the world, to spread the gospel, etc. But here in their own home countries, they were not really ready to share equality with their own women. With only a few exceptions, women were not allowed to participate in the affairs of the church. So that also was largely appropriated by the male members. Women were robbed of their self-confidence, self-respect, and were totally dependent on men. And this was the situation that was prevailing in most countries of Europe. While husbands had legal power and responsibility for their wives to the extent that they could imprison or even beat them publicly, divorce and child custody laws, they largely favored men, giving no rights to women in Europe during 19th century. Women had to pay property taxes, although they had no representation in the levying of those taxes. So again, this was a tragedy, and so you can well imagine as to how what the ground reality was and how the situation was ripe for the liberation movements which were definitely going to start from 19th century. Now, having discussed these various issues, I shall now take a break, and in the next lecture we would be discussing the 3 waves of women's liberation movement that started in Europe and America, and how this continued to have an influence over the various women's rights movements. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for giving us this session. Friends, you are requested to write to us at info.cec@nic.in. This is the ID where you can post your questions as well as your feedback too. Today we are taking your leave with the promise that we are going to meet again soon and would be discussing more in our series on women in history. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you once again.